Everyone, welcome to our panel on investigative journalism when data meets traditional reporting. I think like all of you heard about the Panama Papers. It's the biggest story at the moment, and we didn't know that it would break this week when we started organizing the panel discussion for this festival. We didn't know that the Panama Papers would break this week, but we knew that the Panama Papers, and we're not going to talk about them because none of us worked on them, but what we knew is that something like the Panama Papers, stories driven by a data leak or stories driven by leaks, are constantly happening. We didn't know that the Panama Papers would break, but we knew that they're not an exception, but they're rather an example of what investigative journalism increasingly looks like today. Everyone knows WikiLeaks. Everyone of you heard of WikiLeaks. Since 2010, when WikiLeaks broke, there's been a major data leak every year, and data-driven investigations happen every month. Every week, there's a story that is based on a bigger or smaller leak, and every week, there's a story that is driven by data, an investigative story. The day that the Panama Papers broke, there were at least two other major stories that broke the same day, and they were actually covering the noise that the Panama Papers generated. The Panama Papers are big in size and scale. There are 2.6 terabytes of data. That means like 1,500 times the scale of the size of WikiLeaks. There are over 11 million documents. But as I said, they're not exceptional. They're exceptional in scale, but they're not exceptional in the way the journalists worked on them. It's not exceptional in what they represent. When the use of data and the use of leaks to work on investigative stories. But what does it mean to have traditional reporting and data journalism working together? 2 years ago, here in Perugia, we would have probably had a panel discussion on data journalism on one side and traditional reporting on the other one. We would have asked ourselves how to make the two work together. How can data journalists and how can traditional reporters work together on stories? Today, we believe that there is no such thing as pure data journalist anymore. Like, if we think of data journalists as geeks who are in front of a computer using numbers to do fancy visualizations, well, yes, partly it's that, but it's not just that. Data journalism is much more. It's much more complicated. Data journalism is analyzing and using big data, but also like scraping the data that already exists. There are terabytes and terabytes of data on the internet that are in theory easily accessible to everyone, but that we need to find and put together. So on one side, you have data journalists who are analyzing data sets that are already available, and on the other side, you have data journalists who are actually building, using the data that is accessible and that is available online to build their own data sets and work on them. And on the other side, there's no such thing as traditional reporters anymore. Traditional reporters still exist, but the way the data journalism has changed somehow, the way also like traditional reporters are working, and traditional reporting has influenced data journalism. So instead of talking about like how can they work together, we now see that the two are actually working together and influencing each other.
So there is a reason why we call this panel the golden age of investigative journalism, and not only because it sounds good. When lots of people think about investigative journalism, they probably think of the old-fashioned reporters who go around knocking at doors, meeting people in dodgy places, parking lots in the dead of the night, and making phone calls till someone answers. So they think of Robert Redford, Bob Woodward, and Dustin Hoffman, Carl Bernstein in All the President's Men. But so these glory days have passed, have passed, and for good, I think. But traditional reporting didn't disappear with them. Actually, it is more actual and probably useful now than ever. Actually, the reporters have always used documents to turn simple research into stories. And what's different now is the scale, so the size of these databases and the number of documents, but also the way of working on them. We need traditional reporters to verify this information, or this big information. We still need to make phone calls. Unbelievable. We still need to call people and check what's in the documents and what's behind the documents. But how do you process big data? So how do you turn data into stories? And this is when data journalists turn up. Here again, not traditional data journalists just working on Excel spreadsheets, making fancy infographics and visualizations, but reporters, true reporters using data to find stories. So we can call it computer-assisted reporting, maybe. WikiLeaks, Snowden, and the Panama Papers showed well how more or less big data are means bigger collaborations between journalists from different countries, across different countries, or within the same newsroom as well. So we've got two very good examples here. Unfortunately, George Arbuthnot from the inside team of the Sunday Times couldn't come, but we have here Megan Lucero from the data editor of the Times and the Sunday Times. So, hi. And you said in an interview recently that all journalists will eventually be data journalists. Can you explain us why and how?
Yes, thank you. It's fantastic being here. Thank you for having us. I think this is, as you mentioned, a golden age of investigative journalism, and I'm calling it that because this is 2016, and the Panama Papers, although it is the biggest leak that any newspaper has ever had and any reporter has ever gone through, I am genuinely of the belief that this is journalism now. This is what journalism will look like tomorrow and the next day and many years after this. This isn't anything of an exception. That data already existed. That data is existing at the moment as you're sitting there on your mobile, as you're typing on your computer. You are putting this data out there, and it is being stored and monitored, and these stories are just waiting to break. I put up here, oh, I don't think my slides are up there yet, data journalism in this sense, and as I mentioned, I'm of the belief that data journalism is simply journalism. We talk about data journalism in different ways. So a lot of people think about it as visualization, right? We've seen these fantastic visualizations coming all around the world, some great pieces of it coming out of Italy. We have people who see it as sort of bite-sized understandings of a story, so something that supplements a story, and you explain and break down the information in charts and graphs. And then you have what my team is doing, which is computational investigative reporting. We're putting data directly into the flow of the newsroom. So for us, that is journalism. Taking something complex and making it understandable is journalism. Processing a lot of information, going wherever the story is, that's journalism. There will always be good journalism and there will always be bad journalism. And I think data journalism is just an example of good journalism, people going to the places where the stories are, and the stories are in data now. That's what's happening. There's an influx of digitization. Information is out there. That's where we need to be heading. And I think examples like you talked about, Watergate, across the board, this isn't anything new. So I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about what we're doing at the Times and Sunday Times, and I'll walk you through a couple of our big investigations, but I think it helps to understand kind of how we set this up and where we think it's going. So my first thing, as I said, data journalism isn't anything new. This slide that I have up here is one of my favorites from the archive from the Times. It's from 1868. And it's just reporting on the census, but it contextualizes the information, and I like the start of it, which says things worth remembering, because I think it constantly reminds us to look back at that. This isn't new, like I said, kind of taking vast amounts of information, which was the population at the time across the UK, and reporting on it. This isn't new. We know examples from John Snow and cholera, Florence Nightingale, all of these people back in the day found stories and data. That isn't anything new. Data visualization isn't new. If you look up there, we have that old, beautiful map of the elections in the UK. This was in the 1870s at the Times. That's how we reported the election. We broke down every constituency and visualized it. And you look on the right, and that's the Telegraph in 2015. There's nothing very different there. And I think it's important to remember this because maybe the means and the production of visualization is slightly different, but visualization isn't new. So anyways, coming into that, we realized at the Times we want to do something different. Data journalism isn't new. Data visualization is not new. And the Times sort of said, well, there's all this data out there. Let's do something about it. But we really wanted to be very clear about what we were doing with our data teams. So we decided we wanted to reinvent this concept of data journalism. We wanted to make it something completely different than what was happening before. The Times is known for being quite distinct. We are the paper of record. We wanted it to continue in that tradition. So we decided to create a computational investigative team. We wanted to put the data directly into our journalism, not in the production, the visualization. We didn't want data to add to the story. Data is the story. We wanted every story process to come from that. So our specific team that we've set up, our computational investigative team, quite tiny at the moment. We work across 2 papers. I have a statistician on staff, programmers, journalists. This is sort of the core team at the moment, but we expand and contract as and when we work on stories. And the idea behind our team is that we work on stories in a way that a human could never do without computing. So journalists, of course, are handling data all the time. We help a little bit with Excel, maybe. We work across a couple different things, but our team is specifically designed to work on something that a human could never do without computing. So we're talking big data, we're talking modeling, matching, pulling things together in a way that you couldn't do before that. We've come across quite a few of those. One of my journalists best coined the work we do by saying that we are of the web, not on the web. So we don't want to just add another story up onto the internet, just add extra information out there. We want it to be of the very fabric of the web. And as we know, the web was built to be open and to morph and move and to kind of search within that. So what we do is programmatic. A couple stories up there. The tax avoidance investigation, which we worked on a couple years ago, obviously has snowballed into amazing findings coming out of the Panama Papers today, but we worked on this story a couple years ago. Essentially, someone came with a list and said, they leaked to us, here's this list of people on a tax avoidance scheme. It was coffee stained, it was wrinkled up, and it was slipped in an envelope and given to our investigative teams, and they said, well, what do we do with this? And they could scan it and they could see really big names that were on there, but they said, well, I'm sure there's a lot of things in there. So they came to our team and said, what can you do with this? When you understand that data is anything, it's any piece of information, we digitized the list and we cleaned it up, and it's amazing the kind of stuff you'll find people putting themselves on a tax avoidance scheme with their personal emails and their phone numbers. And we took that list and we ran it through every possible database you could think of. We looked at politicians, NHS trusts, lawyers, everyone across the board, and we came up with tons of matches that the journalists would have never found without that. And as you can see, that led to inquiries, that led to all kinds of legislation now being changed according to tax avoidance. So these are ways in which our investigation has led to accountability. We have the GP's story that I have up there. We found that our doctors were awarding their own practices with basically their own interest. This was taken again by looking at lists of GPs and their registered interests, and looking at where they were practicing and where they were awarding various NHS grants. And again, matching databases together. And since then, there's been an inquiry, and there's change now happening in the UK because of that. And the last one on the side we were finding that charity executives were earning incomes way above the Prime Minister's salary, and were taking up to 12% of charities' incomes to their own pockets, basically. We took that by looking through troves of documents around financial records of charities and kind of looking that together. So this is, like I said, examples in which we're using the very fabric of computing, of database building, and of digging. And obviously with each of these, as we talked about earlier, there's a combination between the investigative element, the traditional journalism, and the journalist itself. But as I mentioned, we're using techniques that help the traditional journalists move faster and dig deeper and dig in the spaces which the stories are in. But the journalism is the core of the whole thing, and that's kind of what we've come through. You might know about the FIFA files. This is another big story that our paper is known for. 3 front page pieces up here. So this was obviously a leak that was given to us inside of FIFA, looking at where money was moving, where conversations were happening, where bribes were taking place. This was one of the big examples of data coming into the Sunday Times. What we did with that, which is quite interesting, you'll see we kind of built an inbox for readers to go through and look through all the emails and see what was happening. But the nature of how we found and looked through a lot of that data, if you look up at kind of the modular network on there, what we did was a trove of emails that came through and sort of said, my editor said, well, I'm not sure if your team should be involved with this because it's emails, it's text, that's not data. And I said, data is anything you can digitize, we have to remember this. So he said, okay, fine, well, what can you do with it? So gave us this big trove of emails. And what we did is we scraped through the entire database of it and looked out the to, the from, the timestamp, and the subject line. And that was it, just starting with that, not even looking at the contents of those emails, just doing that. We built this modular network. You'll see at the center of the network was bin Hammam's personal assistant who was writing and communicating with these people across the board. And as you look, that is where the tip of the story started. We started looking at where are these conversations happening. We started looking at the clusters that were happening on the side. And as we'd sort of zoom in and say, let's look at these conversations, we started finding really interesting things like, thank you very much for that meeting. Here's a bank transaction for what you've done for me. And we kind of follow it through. So this is, like I said, the very nature of being kind of the web and programmatic analysis of what we've gone through led to, like I said, as we know, massive change and look at what's going on at FIFA. And again, reminding ourselves that data is at that. So our team's working directly with investigative teams, and again, the angle always being about the journalism, but using the technology to advance accountability, transparency, and what we're going through. And the last thing I'll just mention is obviously the doping scandal, which is the latest piece that we worked on. After our paper was the one that broke about Lance Armstrong's doping, an investigation by David Walsh, which is absolutely incredible, dedicated over 10 years of his life to doing that. But because of that story, our paper is now known not only just for sports data, but for kind of looking at these kinds of things. And someone came to us leaked from the IAAF, these are the blood results for the past 10 years of Olympic champions, world championship athletes, and they were the blood test results that were dating across 12 years. So we had a look at that. It was the biggest drug test leak in history. 11 years of data, like I said, over 12,000 blood tests. We found 5,000 athletes in there. And this is the part where ours came in, is we found there was 146 medals under suspicion. So this was the kind of the crux of what we were working with. We were able to look at how it compared to cycling before and have a look at the data that was in there. Essentially, what we were able to find is there was a series of blood results, and we worked with doping experts across the board, those who invented the EPO drug test and people who were under the inquiries for Lance Armstrong, and found the measures in which you would be looking at these blood results. And like I said, we ran tons of analysis on who's on the outliers of these results, where are they coming from. We went and looked at all the medal winners across Olympic and World Championships. We scraped the database, we created a database of medals, and we cleaned the database of blood results, and we merged them together to find out when the athletes were going. I mean, and we weren't just looking at individual ones. There's what's called a biological passport. I'm just gonna zip through here really quick. So we came under scrutiny when this first came out, that we were being very reckless about how we just can come through and make these accusations. But we combated this by coming through with all of the data, and we published, some of the athletes came forward and chose to publish their data in an act of transparency, and it allowed us to sort of be open about our analysis. We didn't just take one test result, blood result, and say that this was out of it. We looked at what's called a biological passport, and you can kind of see this up here. Mo Farah agreed to let us release his blood results. So as you can see, those are his tests over time. And the part that's white in the middle is sort of the clean, natural, normal results for someone, his age, size, all of that. And the gray is kind of where you're looking at the abnormalities. Gumri, who's up here, we can publish his because he was already banned. This was our blood results that we had for him across the board. You can see they're jumping up and down. They're high indicators of when you have a transfusion is when you see the kind of blood results go up and down. So when you've doped and you try to hide it, putting clean blood back into your system, you see these kind of spikes going up and down. So that's an early indicator of that, and you can see the stuff going at the top and at the bottom of the spectrum. This allowed us to sort of look and show and prove that we're not just looking at individual results, and we weren't being reckless with it. We worked with 2 world-renowned experts on doping. We looked at a passport. We looked at data for these athletes across the board, and still, despite all of that, we found 90% of Russian medals in endurance events were suspicious of doping. We got undercover footage of Kenyan athletes being drugged. We kind of went across the board. So like I said, this is, we came out with a couple other stories. We looked at how it affected the marathons, and we had weeks and weeks of these stories, which are here. And like I said, more athletes came forward. And it was incredible to sort of see. It was the first time that athletes had agreed to release that kind of information. It's medical information, so it's quite sensitive, but that's the kind of stuff we're looking through. And this, like I said, is an era in which we're entering. This is blood results that were released to us. The Panama Papers are big, massive databases that are coming out. And as you mentioned, these things are happening every single day. Data journalism is journalism. This is the future. This is data. Every minute of every day is now where our sources are. And I foresee basically a space that we're working in that journalism will look a lot like the assistance of robots in computing. I see us looking at scrapers that we ran overnight ahead of looking at the AP wires. I see people using bots to notify them when they're trying to monitor various sites, and using databases and knowing the databases just on your beat just as much as you might know a source. And these spaces are where we're looking at the moment to expand for journalism itself. So we're running it, like I said, it's at the moment for investigations, but we're going to be spreading this across the newsroom even more to every journalist and every beat. And I think it'd be quite interesting to see where your questions arise from today. But thank you.
Thanks so much. Want me to go for it? Yeah. Well. So yeah, thank you, Megan, for that. It was great. So you said that someone came to you for the doping scandal. So you obtained these data through someone, so a person.
Yes.
So because it often starts with human sources, right? Maybe always starts with human sources. Even the Panama Papers, it's a database, but we know that there was a source behind it. And so it's always about people. Like every kind of journalism is always about people. And people are crucial sources of information. But you must have documents as well, because you must have proof of what you do. And so this is why we have here Crofton, Black, and Abby Fielding-Smith from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, because they've been working together, combining the old and the new techniques of journalism to find stories and to conduct investigations. Can you talk a little bit about your work?
Yeah, sure. So I'll get the slide up if I can. Yeah. So yeah, we thought we'd talk to you about basically one example of a story we did that is kind of trying to do what these guys have been talking about, which is basically using data and using traditional reporting and bring them together and seeing what happens. So this was a story we did about drones, and about the businesses that support the US government in its drone warfare, and basically how we tracked down which companies were providing services and how much money they were making. And it was kind of a data and reporting story, basically. So we're going to basically tell you how we did it effectively. Abby.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I think it's quite interesting to sort of compare, well, this is another thing that data can do for investigative journalism, because in this story it wasn't so much the case that we were aware that there was a big set of data and thought, oh, what stories can we get out of it? It was more that, we report on national security stuff, which is very secretive, obviously, and very hard to find out about. And this is actually kind of a story about how using data enabled us to kind of break through the wall of secrecy surrounding this area. So we kind of started with an idea of something we wanted to find out about and used data to do that, rather than starting with a data set, although the fact that this huge data set existed gave us some ideas of how it might be used.
Yeah, so basically the root of the story was government spending records. So the US, unlike a lot of, well, practically uniquely amongst countries in the world, publishes quite detailed records of how much different government departments pay to contractors, to companies who are doing business with it. And the Defense Department, they also publish these records. And so the records are kind of like, I mean, you could say they are, you could say they're publicly available, but there are certain challenges to accessing them. So, they exist in a database that anyone can access, like you can access it today if you want, you can have a look at it. But it's super kind of badly set up. It's quite hard to actually get information out of it. It's not very sophisticated. And we were like, we kind of felt that somewhere inside this massive information was the stuff we wanted, but the government wasn't really providing tools that could enable us to get it. So we had to kind of build a new system to access this data which already existed. Because what we wanted to do, we decided, was we wanted to look through basically 5 years of transactions between the Defense Department and different companies, and use the records of those transactions to figure out which companies were being paid for stuff to do with drone warfare.
And just to sort of walk back a bit, I think the root of the story was more kind of wanting to understand what role the private sector was playing in the US military's drone operations. We were aware that it was playing a role, but there wasn't very much information about what that role was. And that's kind of what started getting us looking into the sort of depths of federal procurement data.
Yeah, so basically we effectively extracted all the data from the Defense Department's spending records over 5 years. And then we built it into a new database which we could start to query. So we started writing our own queries using SQL, structured query language. So we could then pull out bits of it much more efficiently than the government-provided web portal was enabling us to do. So what we ended up with really kind of at the beginning of the story was we had actually the 5 years of transactions. It was actually 8.3 million records. And each of those records had 55 fields in it. So in fact, that's like 460 million fields, give or take. So I mean, to me, this is kind of quite a large amount of stuff to get your head around. What was included in the data was various things like, which part of the Defense Department had spent the money, what the contract numbers were for like the different transactions, what the name of the company and the address of the company and the location of the company was that was being paid to do the work, sometimes where the work was being done as well, obviously how much money was being paid, and then a kind of a free text field that was like what they call the description of requirement, that was like the key to the whole thing, basically. So obviously we had like 8.3 million of these, and clearly the vast majority of them were absolutely nothing to do with drone warfare or what we were looking for. So we had to kind of figure out how to process these 8.3 million records, which, they account for everything. I mean, it includes like fuel that's being bought, and it includes building works on military bases. It includes like medical care. It includes like anything that any part of the military is spending money on. We had to figure out how to kind of get inside that and extract from it the stuff that was going to find out what we wanted to find. So we were faced with a lot of stuff like this, basically, which we were like, I mean, if you can imagine basically 8.3 million rows of that, that's basically what we had. Although it's a lot wider, I mean, that's only like, I don't know, 12 columns or whatever, so it was 55 columns wide and 8.3 million rows long. So this was kind of fun. And it's sort of at this point, you get to the stage where you have to survive somehow. You have to survive big data, and Abby especially, I think, found it an interesting survival experience, which she's gonna recount kind of how she survived it and like how we managed to get through this rather large data problem that we eventually had.
Yes, so I'm very much of this sort of obsolete traditional reporting background, much more used to kind of meeting people in car parks than going through 8.3 million data records. And I think initially I found it quite overwhelming, all this information, but also I think there is a danger in data journalism that you can allow the data to guide your story too much, and you can sort of get into a thing of doing the story about this because the data is there. And at one point we were heading in the direction of sort of trying to do a story about everything, you know, the entirety of the private sector's involvement in drone operations, which would have, because, you know, that we did have the data to do that, and that would have been huge. But then you have to ask yourself, well, to what extent is that actually a story? To what extent is that interesting? You know, saying a company which manufactures cement, provides cement for, you know, a military base is not inherently very interesting or kind of scandal-worthy. So I was sort of supplementing this data crunching process while it was going on by continuing to kind of talk to people, talk to military experts and stuff, getting more and more of a clue of like what it was that seemed to be the key story in this issue of the private sector's involvement in drones. And what I was increasingly hearing was that, ironically, the US military were drowning in data. The problem was that these drones are so good at hoovering up data, like mainly films, basically, what's called full motion video. You know, that's the whole point of them. They hover up there and they capture real-time film footage. And they were doing this so well that the military was running out of people to kind of watch the films, basically, and process them and get meaningful intelligence out of them. And that seemed to me interesting because that is kind of really quite a sensitive aspect of the whole affair because it impacts on targeting. To bring kind of civilian contractors into that role is interesting. So I kind of argued for us to focus in on that, and that kind of gave us a way of not being overwhelmed by the data, and then we started to look more at like, okay, so how do we understand, how do we look for this role being done in these reams of data, which I think leads us on to acronyms.
Yeah, so if I can get the slides back. Basically we as Abby said, you know, we had identified that the military was essentially drowning in data, and they were employing people to help them go through the data and to do these processes like analyzing the video feeds, analyzing the information that came from the drones. And we wanted to use these 8.3 million records to figure out which were the companies that were doing that. So obviously the way we figured out that we wanted to do it was essentially we kind of started investigating the technologies that were used, and we basically built up a list of terms, a kind of a unique list of terms, if you like, that were involved, which were all, you know, the military loves acronyms, basically, so.
Yeah, and actually a side benefit of this, so we would sort of find these terms in the database and Google them and try and work out what they meant, and, you know, maybe look for them in job ads, or sometimes we would do freedom of information requests and get the actual contract based on information in the database, and then we'd sort of see it delineated in the contract terms what these three-letter acronyms meant. But yeah, as well as like enabling us to interrogate the database more effectively, understanding all these acronyms also meant that when we went to talk to human sources in the military, we spoke their language and we were able to sort of say, so, you know, what's a typical PED composition in ISR in your area? And, you know, they respect the fact that you can talk their language, which means they're much more likely to talk to you, basically.
Yeah, so we ended up with a kind of a list of these acronyms. So like Abby just mentioned, ISR, which is Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance, FMV, Full Motion Video, PED, Processing, Exploitation, Dissemination, MQ is an acronym for the Reaper or the Predator drones, GMTI, the Ground Moving Target Indicator, UAV, Unmanned Aerial Vehicles. So anyway, we built up a list of these things and we started running them through the database, pulling out the transactions that involved these terms. And we were lucky in a way because like these acronyms typically don't appear in normal words. So there aren't like, you don't get a lot of false positives. The one weird one that we got was I was getting like all these things about fruit deliveries. And I thought that was kind of strange. But then of course it turned out that UAV is in the middle of the word guava. But discounting things like that, I mean...
That's our follow-up investigation.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, you never normally find the letters M and Q next to each other unless you're talking about a Predator or a Reaper drone. It's fine. So we would basically run these terms through, and you know, the beauty of having, you know, 8.3 million records is, it's kind of big, it's big data, but actually you can still run a search for these terms. It takes like 30 seconds or something, so that's quite nice. So we would write little scripts like this. I mean, this is a very basic, like, simple SQL script. I mean, like, anyone can do this, basically. And I should say that neither of us are, you know, we're not programmers. I'm not a programmer. So we would write little scripts like this, and eventually we get kind of our 8.3 million rows of data starts to actually look more like this, where we have, you know, you can see at the top there's like one of the, there are a couple of our acronyms there, ISR, PED. You can see next to it there's a contract number. You can see next to that there's what they call a place of performance, which is where it's happening. So what this tells us is the place of performance is Hurlburt Field. Well, we know that that's the Special Operations Air Base in, is it Florida? Yeah. You can see it, then we've got the company name, Zell Technologies. I mean, basically, they're not a big firm. Nobody had really heard of Zell Technologies before we did this story. You know, they're a pretty small, boutique, niche military intelligence firm. You can see how much money they got, like that's $12 million there for that contract. And of course, because you got the contract number there, well, we could do a FOI request for that, and actually we did end up getting that contract, so we could see the exact terms that what they were being asked to do, and you know, where and how many people they were employing, and so on and so forth.
And again, just, I don't know how many of you here are sort of from a non-data background, but it's just worth noting, because you might see all this and sort of think, God, I couldn't imagine doing an SQL query, and I had never done anything like this before, as Crofton said. And what is really interesting is that once you start doing it, once you kind of know what you're working towards, and someone gives you the basic tools to do it, it actually gets really addictive. And I found myself spending weekends just running SQL queries on the database in my spare time, just for the sheer fun of it. Like, that's the joy of data.
You never told me that before. But I mean, obviously, like, so it was kind of an iterative process, basically. So once we had done that one time, you know, then that would enable us to find other terms in the same contracts, and then we run that through the system. So basically, we could just keep on doing this. So we were constantly finding new terms, finding better terms, running them through the system, figuring out the companies that were doing them, seeing what else those companies were doing, taking the terms from that, running them through the database. And as it says, so we followed this kind of simple chart here, of like moving down the process and then back to the beginning, until, obviously, as it says, continue until enlightenment strikes or time and money runs out. So basically, that was the kind of data element of the story, if you like. But of course, the story itself did not simply come from analyzing the data. It had to come from a kind of cross-section of lots of other things.
Yeah, I mean, I think what eventually kind of made it a story and made it, we ended up publishing it in partnership with The Guardian, and they sort of splashed it on their US homepage, and it got picked up in a lot of US news outlets. was actually kind of the detail of like what the day-to-day experience of these civilians doing these jobs was like, which you could only get through actually talking to people, and which, you know, which really brings home quite the kind of sensitive work that they were doing as civilian contractors, even though, you know, civilian contractors are technically not supposed to be involved in life and death decisions, or not supposed to be making life and death decisions, according to kind of US regulations. You know, in practice, they were so close to it that, you know, indeed, as one of them said to us, if you mess up in this job, people die, which ended up being the sort of pull quote. And again, just going back to what I was saying before, I mean, this was a kind of perfect marriage in a way of the two reporting techniques, because there's no way that I could have got into those conversations with people had I not, A, sort of known what kind of questions to ask them and to talk their language, and B, sort of known like what kind of sectors to find them in and stuff. So it wouldn't have been possible to have just started from nothing and find these people and get quotes from them like that. And that's kind of what made the story, was having all that kind of data spine.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, the kind of database at the center of it was supplemented by like loads of other material, which was, you know, other public source material, basically like press releases from companies, contracting documents that we got through FOI or through other, found on the internet or whatever, auditing documents and oversight documents that the government had released, people writing about their work on recruitment sites, and, you know, all this stuff basically combined into the story at the end of the day. And because, I mean, I guess we wanted to like give you an insight into like the whole process of like, you know, how we did it. And I mean, it took quite a long time. I should say all of this took about 9 months, I think, altogether. But we have some kind of like, I guess, takeaways from it that are what we figured afterwards about, you know, what had worked and what hadn't worked, and like what we think, you know, our lessons learned from data journalism, if you like. So, I mean, we've mentioned some of them already, but I just put a little list up here. So the first one is really important, like your screen is always too small. You always need a bigger screen. That's really the, is that right, yeah? Yeah, that's like that's the main one.
Have 4 screens?
Yeah, so don't do it on a laptop or you'll go totally nuts. Don't do it on a tablet. So, I mean, do you want to talk through some of these points, or I mean, you've said some of them already, right? Like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that I also learned from the experience is the importance of, you know, the importance of having kind of two heads working together, and I guess the importance of people more steeped in kind of database interrogation, working with people who are from a more traditional reporting background, and sort of learning from each other, because often, you know, I wouldn't have the material, but I could see the story when there was the material, and you would find stuff that I would never have thought it possible to find. So like once we were preparing actually to give a talk at a conference, and Crofton pulled up for one of the slides, he just kind of pulled together this sample of like, he ran a search on the database for like military spending in Iraq, and he was just showing me the slides before he went to the conference, and I was like, that is a really interesting record, what the hell? We realized that there was this like special forces training contract which hadn't been like reported on at all, and I made him take it out of the conference, and we did a story on it, but I would never have like spotted that myself, and you would have been quite happy to just give that away to people. So, yeah, the importance of teamwork, basically.
And also, yeah, it's quite, you know, like that's an example of how once you have this kind of resource, you can basically sort of start to play around with it, and just because it only takes, you know, 30 seconds or a minute to like run a search, then, you know, you can pretty much run whatever you want, whatever you feel like. One day you'll be like, oh, what's the military spent on this in such and such a year or in such and such a place? You can just basically fool around when you've got nothing to do, and eventually sort of little ideas for stories start to pop up, which is how I spend my time. So, I mean, I think like Abby, we put on this list, if you're working with a non-data journalist, force them to use the database, even if they don't want to. And Abby now has a kind of like a Stockholm syndrome relationship with the database, where she loves it even more than I do. So I think this in itself is a beautiful thing to behold. I think really that's all we have to say on that particular story. Do you want anything else you want to say?
No, it'd just be really interesting to hear maybe more about other people working on similar projects when we go into Q&A.
But I've seen you two work together in the office, and you're still sitting with your laptop, calling people all the time, and he's still like taking out like FOIs and documents and finding things. And when you see something on your laptop, you're like, Crofton, have you seen this? Yes, I did. So like,
yeah, sometimes I show him stuff first.
yeah, it's true. But why do you, like, you already said that, but I want to hear from you as well. Like, why do you still, yeah, it's not data journalism anymore, it's data within brackets. But why is the reporting, the traditional reporting, still important? Why can't you just do that on your own? Like, why do you still need to partner up with someone else who helps on the other side, on the more traditional reporting side?
I'm quite interested to know what Megan's got to say.
I was going to say, I mean, their example is crucial for this. I think it's a similar thing when WikiLeaks came out, right? There was this massive leak of information, but Julian Assange just left it. He just put it out there. He didn't try to find stories. He didn't try to put, he just opened that up there. I think that was the difference between sort of a leak like that and when something comes out, for instance, Panama Papers or whatever it is, where they took the time to find what was in it. There's a distinction between just data for data's sake and journalism for journalism's sake. And I think there will always need to be that. When I meant that data journalism is just journalism, and I said, you still have to be a good journalist. You have to be completely exhaustive. You have to be ruthless. You have to dig. Like, that's what journalism is. You have to find the best story, and you want to get the story better than anyone else, and you've got to go where the data is. Maybe it used to be, sometimes it's going to war zones, sometimes it's piling through, in Watergate, it was looking through tons and tons of paper files. Well, now, where it sits is digitized, so you have to go there. And all we're doing is we're providing the technological tools to go where the stories are. The journalism itself is still king. Like, you cannot put, I would still never put a programmer who never looked into journalism straight into the newsroom to write stories. They wouldn't find that. You still have to be a journalist first, 100%. And then you go into, I thought it was really interesting you used the word drowning in data though. I think that was fantastic because that's what it is right now. There's so much information, and I think those who can actually swim, you've got to know how to swim to get through it. And if you know how to dig through where the information is, then you will rise above the kind of the rest. You'll find the stories that no one else is finding. But like I said, journalism will always kind of be the center of that. And I thought it was also interesting that you mentioned you were more efficient than the government allowed themselves to be. And I think this is crucial, and this is something I found across the board. Not only are just everyday journalists trying to figure it out, in most cases, in my experience, the sources of the data themselves don't understand it or know it. And this is a really, really interesting area to me. FOI, freedom of information, has been under threat in the UK. Luckily, it's staying at the moment, but the government was looking to scrap it for a while. It's been a really important part of what we do as journalists, to be able to publicly request and have the right to request information. But I think the larger issue for me has always been that FOI shouldn't even exist to begin with. The data should already be public. It should already be accessible. And the reason why FOI is so expensive is because they have people who have to sit there and pull the files up that you request and figure them out. And most of them don't know how to do it. The number of times I've worked with government officials on data, they don't understand it, and they've sent me errored data that's an absolute mistake. They've made a lot of errors in that. And luckily, we don't ever want to report something in that we're kind of working with them and we're educating each other. But it's just quite interesting because it's not just us. And I think innovation that's happening in journalism has to be innovation that goes across society. Government needs to change in the same way. They need to have this sort of thing. NGOs, public sectors, academics, everyone has to be doing this because this is where our society exists. So I think it's just, like you said, it's quite interesting. I found that very similar. Government they don't understand a lot of their data. This is why. And if they knew it, it would be more effective, I think. And that's where a lot of our accountability and a lot of the public interest reporting that we do happens, because we can find where that is. We can find the inefficiencies. And a lot of that has to do with data.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And actually, it's funny. I mean, you can get a bit paranoid sometimes working in the national security reporting sphere. Because, particularly in the drone program, because some aspects of drones are done by the CIA, so that's like completely classified, and some are done by the military, which aren't. And so sometimes there'd be stuff where there was stuff published about it, and the contract was published, and the government made an announcement saying we've published this contract. And sometimes there wouldn't be, or it wasn't possible to find it, or that it would just seem like, or that the data was weirdly elliptical, and it seemed to us like, ooh, are they trying to hide something here? And then the more you sort of look into it, you're like, or maybe they just did it incompletely because they were just a human being doing that, and they just didn't do it. And I spent a bit of time in DC reporting the story and talking to a lot of people that have worked with open source data, with government data, and in the freedom of information arena. And it sort of became clear that a lot of it just comes, a lot of stuff, some stuff getting out and some stuff not getting out. You think it's like some big conspiracy when stuff isn't released. And sometimes it's just like the individual sort of officers aren't really sure whether they're allowed to release that information or not, so they just err on the side of caution because there's no downside to them really in doing that. So, yeah, it's really like, the government's, I know, Crofton, you dealt at the kind of sharp end with some of the incompleteness of the data released by the government and the errors. And
should we take some questions from the audience? Anyone wants to ask something?
You're scared them. No? Yes?
Okay.
Do we have a microphone? Maybe? You want to start here? Maybe. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Anyway, my question was, I was part of a similar project, which was also, I worked a bit on a project which also attempted to track government spending, but the problem we encountered was that it was often reported in bulk. So we tried to, for example, when we tried to understand how much European governments spend on border controls, we weren't able to do that because it is reported in bulk and we cannot possibly extract it from there. Do you have any recommendations for this problem?
It's a big difference between America and practically every other country. Like, because in America they report on the sort of granular, like transaction by transaction level. Like mostly in Europe and the UK, it's aggregated in some way or other. Like, not always, but I mean, it's very, if it's aggregated, then it's kind of tough to do stuff, right? I mean, you can do different kinds of things, but you can't do the kind of thing that we did with this. So we couldn't do this same project in any country in the world except for the US, I don't think. It wouldn't work in the UK. I don't think it would work anywhere in Europe, really.
I would just add to that, I think, like he was saying, the US is quite systematic about how they publish data. And I know the UK is a little bit better, but then we start going outside of it in Italy, I know that it's not as easy. One thing I found that quite interesting is that when we were talking about FOI and when you request information, one thing I think that people don't often do is you can request the schema of the data. So most people just ask the question that they want to ask, which is how much spending is on X or Y. But you're asking a very tiny sliver of what they have out of what they might possibly have. So a really good thing is you can write to the information officer or the government department and say, what is your schema of your data? So what is it that you hold? So before you even ask for what's inside of it, basically understand the structure. So they can say, we have government department, we have this spending, we have this in disbursements, whatever it is. And I think that's quite helpful because then you know how to find out what is available and what is not available. I found that to be really useful when I'm asking for it, because then you might find out there is no metadata on a specific department and you might have to go elsewhere to find it. But also I just find that to be a useful trick.
I just wanted to add one thing. As Emanuele and I worked before as journalists, but I'm now studying at City University investigative journalism, and one of the things that we found out is that it's so great to have like governments actually like in the UK and the US giving you all the data available, although like it's kind of messy and you have to go through it and you have to know what you're looking for and how to ask it. But in Italy, for example, there's no such thing as that. And in a lot of other countries, there's no such thing as that. And what we found out when we were working on some projects is that the balance between traditional reporting and data journalism is tilting on one side or the other. Because for Italy, for example, we couldn't find the figures for on immigration and other stuff. And so like we found some official data, but it was aggregated and we didn't really understand, like we had some questions. So we picked up the phone and started calling officials and asking them like, you compiled that data, what does it mean? Why is it like that? And they were the ones who actually gave us the answers because we kind of like challenged them. So like at the end we had the data, but we had to go through making phone calls and stuff.
It's not just talking about FOI. I mean, it's not only freedom of information. We're talking about like publishing data from the government, and I think that this is a very serious problem in Italy.
There are 1, 2 questions.
2 questions, I guess. 3.
Okay. Yesterday there was this German journalist from Corrective, Stefan Vermeyer, who made another panel about data journalism, and he said that one of the most important things is about transparency and the ability to replicate data journalism. They think, and one of their future objects is to let the reader be aware of what are the statistical terms and the statistical theories used to extract the data, and to make him also aware of a computational method to do that by himself. Do you think that, I know that a lot of like big newspapers are working on that. Is that as well the stance of the Sunday Times, and do you think that it is important? Thank you very much.
Should we take the 2 or 3 questions together and then?
Yeah. No, just answer that one. It's fine.
Okay.
Just do it before.
I'll just answer that quickly. Absolutely agree with that. I think at the end of the day, we're all journalists that are obsessed with journalism, but readers don't care. They don't care where the story comes from. They just know it's a good story, it's a breaking story, it's a whatever that is. They don't care how you got there. They trust you for being whatever paper that you're at. So I absolutely agree on that sense. You want to make the complex simple. You still have to come back and you have to write like a journalist. You can't write like a statistician or a programmer. That will always be the case. And so there's going to be there's a lot of extra work and investment in having to build these teams to do that, even when readers may not completely understand it. We do it in subtle ways. At the Times, the Sunday Times, we call it the Times data team analyzed X, Y, or Z. We'll put that in the story subtly to help people understand that there is a data team and that this has come through. But like I said, we try to kind of keep that in the background. And we'll publish methodology online for those people that are interested. But like you said, you don't want the reader to feel that. But I think it's quite interesting you mentioned the iterative process and to reproduce something. This is also very much of what we do. We talk about robot journalism. There might even be, I think there's a couple of panels here this week on it. And my interest in robot journalism is not so much about automating a story, but it's about a lot of what my team is doing currently at the moment is creating databases and creating processes that can continue constantly. So if we write a script that looks to match a politician with another database, we write it in a way that we can run it again with a new database every time it comes in. We have databases that come out every quarter, for instance. We have a historical database, and when a new quarter of expenses is released, we just add that to it. We do a lot of work in the beginning to build that, and then every quarter there's a new sort of iteration of that. The script is already written, the documentation is already there, and that's the beautiful thing about putting programming into journalism, is that you don't have to do it over again. This will make your lives faster. This will allow you to do all the kind of hands-on human contact reporting if you can sort of automate and speed up some of the kind of earlier process. So I absolutely agree with that. I don't know if you do as well.
I just wanted to bring a testimony on a story we were doing on ETS, the European Trading Scheme, on CO2 allowances. Like, it's public. The European Union every year puts like database, but it's really hard to use, really hard. And there is a firm based in France whose business is to make that database more easy to use and more understandable. And we were like, okay, if we want to like gain some time, maybe 6 months, we have to pay. And they were charging like a lot of money, like €1,000, or take time and maybe write the story when it's too late. And we were like, I was wondering if you had already some kind of issue like this, because there is the open government, like there is the government doing open data, so we called them to say, okay, we have to make this database more usable, but already it's like a 1 year work. So we're like, okay, what do? We pay to make the story now, and then we do it later. Is it easy for all the journalists? I was wondering.
I mean, yeah, like, I mean, I told you that that single story was was basically 9 months of work, but actually, like, the first 3 months was kind of setting up the database, and the next 3 months was kind of playing around with it and figuring out, like, you know, the best way to use it and what we could find in it and what we could not find in it. And then, you know, the remaining 3 months was actually properly reporting that story, basically. So it did take quite a long time to construct, and I mean, we are, you know, but now it's a pretty good resource, so we're using it to build more stories, and my hope is that, you know, at some point this year we're going to be able to release the whole thing publicly anyway, so that other people can replicate doing what we've been doing with it and find different things in it and follow the stuff that they themselves are interested in that I'm not interested in or whatever. But I mean, yeah, it is like, you know, actually I wanted to do a project like this for about 2 years before I found someone crazy enough to pay me to actually build that resource. I totally sympathize with your situation, and I mean, yeah, it's kind of it is an ongoing issue, obviously.
I would just add that is the crux of the problem, I think, at the moment, why data journalism is new but not really happening, and why teams like mine aren't existing across the board. You know, I'm very fortunate that they've decided to invest in this kind of thing, but time is money, and most papers, as we know, are being cut constantly by their journalists, and they don't, you know, you've got to convince a paper, or you've got to convince whoever it is that to give someone that kind of time, like, people don't have that anymore. The traditional journalists I know in our newsroom, churning out 3 stories a day, they aren't even given time to do their offbeat, off-diary stories anymore. Investigations are really hard to do because they're just under this pressure to produce, because newsrooms are shrinking and we're trying to produce all this. So time is extremely precious to be given months. You know, for doping, we worked on that for 3 months. I mean, that was a lot of time that they gave us, but we knew it was worth it in the end. And I think this is the issue at the moment, is where is that money going to come from? Where are those resources going to be, unless newsrooms and people find this has to be invested in, this is crucial. I think the only way around it, I would suggest, is a lot of the Open Data Institute, Open Data Services. There's a lot of grants and funds, Mozilla, Ford, a lot of them they are looking to help partner up and fix a lot of these things. I think those are solutions at the moment. I've been having to kind of find a little bit of side solutions to get extra resources and time from researchers who want to help out. I found that to be quite useful. But I think you're basically hitting on the exact point of why it's hard to find it everywhere. It's expensive, but I'm hoping that, like I was talking about, the iterative processes when we do kind of automate things and make them quicker and make journalists more efficient, it'll allow for more time for investigative work like that. But I wish you luck.
There was a question there, and then there was also a question from Peter Crest.
I'll be quick. If we want to start our website of investigative journalism here in Italy, because we feel that investigative journalism is not enough covered in Italy, what is your first advice?
Can we?
I think that's for you.
Oh.
Go study, train.
No,
abroad.
Don't say that.
No, doing investigative journalism in Italy is hard. There's a tradition somehow, but it's completely different. And the way, well, like, the problem starts with newsrooms, in my opinion, like with editors who are asking you different standards from what they ask you abroad. One of the things that we found amazing in working and, like, studying and working in London and working with these guys is that you find a story and you think like, oh, this is a great story, I can just publish it. And then the editor comes and is like, no, you don't have a story. You have a bunch of things that you think could be a story, but you don't have evidences. And then you have evidences for like the first time you come up with something, you have evidence. And someone else, like the person involved, denies it to you, and you cannot publish it because you can be sued for libel. So you need stronger evidence. But what happens is that the editor is pushing you to find those confirmation, and at the same time is pushing you to have a bigger story. And it's something that I think in Italy we don't actually really do it. So I don't know what's the advice to set up something, but probably like to try to learn from these guys, like the things that they're doing, and try to do something. There's nothing really out there in Italy. Like there are a few things, there are a few really good examples, but there's not much like done by major newspapers. So there's actually space to do that. There's space to learn what they're doing and replicate it. You just have to try.
It's also like Megan said about it's all about hard news in this moment. I don't think that journalists write 3 articles per day. I think that they write like 13 maybe. So yeah, it's really hard to give an advice about that, except maybe go and make some experience abroad and then come back and change this country.
Bit aggressive.
Yeah, thanks very much. A fantastic presentation, by the way, really, really fascinating. Megan, you touched on this, and I just really wanted to invite you to expand on this. The way that this kind of journalism, whether there's a future in terms of collaborations. The Panama Papers clearly was an extraordinary collaboration. Whether you feel that there is a future in terms of overcoming some of the technical problems, the financial problems, the time problems and so on with collaborations, or whether in fact this is something that's becoming harder to do because of the fragmenting of the whole media space.
It's a really good question. I think it's quite similar to what she was mentioning earlier about not having the time and resource to it. I mean, Panama Papers is incredible, like you said, in terms of collaboration. I mean, they used people for the visualization, they used different people for the data analysis, they teamed up with media partners across the board. I mean, when you look at the number of people who were involved in that, it is incredible. And it is incredible that it stayed quiet and no one knew until it kind of came out in the end. I definitely think that is the space where we're at. I currently collaborate with academics at the LSE. I collaborate with students up in the University of Manchester. I'm constantly trying to pull people into my newsroom, as I mentioned, because we need more resources, despite being given as much as we have. But I am still very weary of sort of latching on to other groups. I'm, like I said, very fortunate, though, that I can have most of it all in-house, and the Times is very particular about it. I mean, even when we do visualization, they all want, it's very Times designed, and they want all that in, whereas a lot of times, the Guardian Data Blog, for instance, is really well known for allowing people who do visualization all over to publish onto their site. And I think the Guardian used to also very rely on people like ScraperWiki to do the scraping for them, and I think it's great because it saves you time and it saves you money, but you start to kind of expand a little bit outside of your newsroom. You become a bit dependent on other people. I think it really does come down to the budget and the resources and what you have at the moment, and you have to be as innovative as possible. You know, just like before this, in traditional journalism, you would collaborate with various people who knew specialty things, and you would pull them in. Similarly, you can do that here. So I'm of two minds of it. I think there is definite need for collaboration. I think that's where the most innovation happens, when you've got various different people. That's why my team is so interdisciplinary. Because I love having people who came from all different backgrounds and different angles to it. But I also am a bit wary of casting too wide a net. If it's massive like that, it makes sense. But if you start relying as a newspaper on, okay, we're going to use ScraperWiki to do the scraping, and then we're going to have this visual team to do the visuals, it starts becoming less about the newsroom as it is just a project that a bunch of people are working on. But not everyone has the ability to do that. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, other than that I think we need to skill up our newsrooms to be as resourceful as possible. But I think it's fantastic to be able to collaborate across the board, especially when it advances journalism in that way.
one of the things that you were saying before the panel, actually, when we were having coffee, is that the great thing about data journalism and data is that no one can really steal it from you.
Yeah.
So like, that allows you to, since you have the data and no one else has it, if it's like a leak, or since you took the time to script the data and look into it and work it and create your own database, you can actually like maybe even talk to other journalists and share ideas and talk to other newsrooms and try to find ways to collaborate around that.
It's true, you make a really good point that I made earlier that I forgot I said. But basically, the interesting thing is journalism has always been this kind of closed net, right? This is my story, this is my thing, we don't tell anyone about it. I mean, even just working at the Times and the Sunday Times, stories would break on a Sunday that none of us knew about, and they loved doing that. They loved even surprising the journalists in their own newsroom. I mean, that is traditional journalism, is the front page, big surprise. But we live in an age where we can't be doing that anymore. And that's the big culture change I'm finding right now. I'm trying to move the newsroom into this area that they find really difficult, which is open yourself up, allow other people to help you, see how you can pull out of all of these various things. It's in the nature of journalists. It's in the nature to be as resourceful and innovative as possible. But they find it quite difficult. You know, if we wanted to use Mechanical Turk, which is basically an online ability for people to come and work and automate some of your information. And the idea that you would let someone in, some citizen journalist in on your story, to them was mind-boggling. But again, you can't, in the world of data, no one can take your story. And I was telling them earlier, everything is built. We all are built off of somebody else's work. All the data tools that we use, the web is built off of somebody else's work. So we're in an area, I think, where we have to open ourselves up. You can't, you don't want to break your story, but no one can take a story away from you unless they have the data. And even if they did, their legal teams would never let you publish it without having it. So it needs to open, and we need to collaborate in that sense.
Also, I think I totally agree with you that the sort of times are changing, and you just can't be that kind of possessive about a story anymore. And partly because of the hugeness of data, but also because so many stories that we're all working on these days are transnational stories that span borders, which is kind of why conferences like this are great, and it's a chance to kind of meet other journalists internationally. I mean, when I think of like one of the biggest sort of recent scoops that there's been in Britain, it was like the unmasking of another member of this group of the Beatles, of these like jihadis in ISIS, which was done as a collaboration between BuzzFeed and the Washington Post, which isn't something you'd know, like even like 5 years ago, you just wouldn't have thought of that being something that would happen. But I think the culture is changing quite a lot.
And the match fixing was between the BBC and BuzzFeed as well. Exactly.
There was a question there.
Quick question.
This is kind of a niche question, so I apologize. But so I'm doing my PhD in the future uses of Twitter in local news. And so we're talking about what is the future of journalism. But I'm curious if this big collaboration between data and traditional journalism can actually survive on Twitter, because I think a lot of journalists kind of waste what Twitter can do by just putting out their own opinions, and it's very fragmented, and you can't get a full story. But I also think there is room for improvement, and we can find better ways to use Twitter. But do you think that we can find this marriage between data and traditional journalism and actually use it on Twitter in a meaningful way? Or is it just not the right medium for it?
How would it sort of look in a... sorry, I'm a bit confused. Like, how would collaboration on Twitter be? Like, sort of people saying, hey, I'm looking into this, like crowdsourcing or...
A little bit. And I think there's a lot more room to bring in people from the outside, citizen journalists and things like that. Because, like we were saying, journalism can be very closed off, and we don't want to talk about it with anybody else. But is there a way to get these big stories, like about these big data sets and doping and drones and things like that? Is there a way to use that on Twitter in a way that people can understand at 140 characters with short videos?
So, I don't know about using Twitter to kind of tell the stories, but you probably know, given your PhD, this guy, Brown Moses, who's, I think, a really good example of how you can leverage social media for your investigations in a very kind of cool way that kind of, crowdsources stuff, but then uses other tools and techniques to verify and cross-reference what's being crowdsourced. Yeah. I'm not sure about the sort of how the story is told on Twitter. Is that what you're asking?
A little bit, yeah. I just with the future of, if this is the future of future of journalism, does a website like Twitter fit into that future?
I think if you like Twitter, then you can tell any length of story on it broken down into 140 character chunks. I mean, you can write a novel on Twitter if you want, right? Like, I mean, it just depends if that sort of floats your boat or not. I mean, I think that, it's up to people use Twitter in quite creative ways. So if yeah, sure. I mean, why not? Somebody could tell find some way of telling a kind of data-intensive, long-winded, long-form story on Twitter. I'm sure that's possible. But I mean, I think you have to be invested in Twitter as a medium to want to do that, basically.
I would just add to that I think Twitter, like I said, is used in Investigative for verifying, for finding people. You can use the metadata around Twitter a lot to investigate. So that's like a lot of what I'm interested in. And I think there's a lot of panels happening around videos and social sharing and how you tell those stories. But I guess my interest really is that, I mean, this can go on into a completely different panel, but Twitter is dying. And I think if you focus too much on Twitter, you're focusing on a single thing. I mean, we're talking about the future. You're talking about spaces where we're sharing things, and that can look completely different tomorrow. I mean, it's changing constantly in the way that we share information. So I think I think maybe it wouldn't necessarily be to focus on Twitter itself, but to focus on how we communicate, how we share it, how we interact, and if it is about crowdsourcing or if it is about something like that, there's so many platforms. I mean, WhatsApp is on the rise. I mean, mobile is on the rise at the moment. We talk about, Storeful talks about basically they're using WhatsApp and they're using all these messaging. I mean, Viber all across the world, all the different messaging apps are used right now for sharing videos and live verification. I mean, there's a transition right now that's moving much more into the chat space. And I think there's a lot that can be seen there. So I think I wouldn't focus so much on Twitter because the dynamics constantly changing. But look into mobile and look into the chat sphere because it's something that we're looking into currently. There's a lot of data out there, and Storeful is doing that at the moment where they're breaking stories that are being shared through messaging. It's Telegram. Really interesting, but that's a whole nother panel and talk. But we can chat afterwards if you're interested.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, that's it.
Yes, that's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Hope you enjoyed it.